my background is in Homeland Security and emergency management. I ended up being the first female in the state of Georgia to graduate with that degree. Asfalis is actually Greek for the words safe, secure, and sure. And essentially what we help our clients do is we put them back in control. We bring clarity to confusion, and we ultimately give them a strategy for an evolving threat. A threat can be cybersecurity, workplace violence, active shooter, coronavirus, or it can be a supply chain disruption that's impacted their company.
Okay, so which is a very, very timely topic. So now, before you started this business, what was your background? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Virginia Beach, Virginia. Grew up in Atlanta, been in Charlotte for 6 years. And prior to running my own practice, the first thing that happened is I experienced a tornado with wind speeds exceeding 135 miles per hour.
Wow.
And I was literally sitting in my car on a beautiful Friday afternoon. And as day turned to night, there was a loud pounding sound on my car, and it was hail. And I didn't know at the time that it was hail.
Wow.
The wind speeds were blowing so fast that my car began shaking back and forth and back and forth. And a light pole fell parallel to my car. A brick building fell next to my vehicle. And when the wind speeds picked up, it burst the windows in the car. So glass went everywhere, and my car went off the ground while I was inside of it.
Wow. Okay.
And I'm literally, right? So I'm literally sitting in the car, and there's cars, dumpsters, billboards, everything that you can imagine was flying towards my head.
Oh, wow.
And for the first time in my life, I realized you are not in control. There was absolutely nothing I could do to change what was happening to me but pray. So I said a prayer, the car dropped, and hours later, because this was pre-Twitter, I found out that I was in the middle of a tornado, and it happened in the city of Atlanta. So it was the first tornado on record to hit in the heart of the city.
Wow.
One person lost their life, 50 people lost their homes. It destroyed everything from the east and the west sides. And so that also taught me that just because it hasn't happened yet, doesn't mean that you shouldn't be prepared for it. So whether that is a pandemic, whether that is a vulnerability from a cyber perspective, or whatever your challenges are for your business, just because you haven't seen a threat yet doesn't mean that you shouldn't be prepared for it. So that was my personal crisis that really had me at a place where I could fall in love with the profession and with the industry, because it hit me personally. And it also is what has given me empathy for other people that are now going through this pandemic, because I completely understand what it's like to be in a crisis when you don't know how to navigate your way out of it. So fast forwarding, my background is in Homeland Security and emergency management. I ended up being the first female in the state of Georgia to graduate with that degree. And that led me to working for the Department of Homeland Security, a manufacturing aviation company, as well as a Fortune 50 retail company. Okay. And so through all of my public and private experience, my work has been in developing crisis preparedness programs, building out business continuity programs. So helping clients to think through, if you don't have your people, your technology, or your assets, the buildings that you walk in and out of every single day, how do we continue to do business? And then ultimately risk management, helping them to identify known and unknown threats, and then giving you a strategy to be able to continue to operate. So that's been the bulk of my experience, and working with leadership teams across the world and helping them to, see that. Oftentimes the questions that we ask, no one else in the business is asking those questions. Okay. So it's always an interesting conversation, because they're not getting asked the questions about risk management from an operational perspective that we typically focus on.
Okay, so you just gave us a lot. And I was like, wow. And when I say a lot, I mean, as far as like most people don't have the luxury of, hey, I went into the profession that I went into because I had a life-threatening moment that really spurred my interest. I think with that, I mean, myself being, my background is finance and accounting. There's no life-threatening situation that could really spur you to say, "Hey, I want to become an accountant" or something.
Well, the '08 financial crisis, maybe.
Yeah, it's not the same as a tornado.
Fair, fair.
Now, from that, talking about like you mentioned that being the first in the state of Georgia to graduate with that degree, because there was no one that went before you. Like, what kind of spurred you to really go after that?
So that's an interesting question. You know, so I graduated from a historically Black college and university, and I have a lot of respect and I really, really appreciate the HBCU experience and what it taught me about my ancestors, what it taught me about my history that I did not learn at a PWI.
Mhm.
So that's first and foremost is I definitely respect and appreciate the foundation that my institution was able to provide for me. When I enrolled at Savannah State University, there's no way that I thought that I would be the first female by the time I graduated and made history. Like, never.
Yeah.
But I am an athlete by trade. So I grew up playing basketball, running track and gymnastics, and a cheerleader. So I am competitive at nature and I don't like to lose.
Okay.
So from that perspective, I just think that the opportunity presented itself, and actually how it came up, my dean had a conversation with me and she said, "Hey, I'm looking at the data and it looks like you're going to be the first female to graduate with this degree because Savannah State was the only, and still is, the only HBCU in the nation to carry a dual degree program in Homeland Security and emergency management, let
Wow.
alone only historically Black college and university in the state of Georgia to carry that curriculum." And
Mhm.
so my thought process was, well, I need this in writing from my institution so people believe me. And what's interesting is, of course, we met some opposition through that process. But what I've also learned as a woman, as a businesswoman, and as a woman of color is no one's going to advocate for you harder than you.
Mhm.
And so it was my responsibility to make sure that my institution recognized the importance of getting that documented. And then also at my graduation ceremony, they made the announcement on my behalf. And
Okay.
so it's always that dynamic of being able to speak up for yourself and to help people to understand your value and what you bring to the table. Because think about it, 20 years later, if I would have never asked for that,
Yeah.
then that may be a challenge in terms of being able to continue to tell that that story.
Okay. Okay. So now from there, you go into Homeland Security. What was that experience like? Kind of what were your expectations coming in? And then what was the reality of working in that job like?
Yeah, it was interesting. So I moved to California and I worked with a group of postdoctoral engineers from the University of Southern California. And we specifically were assigned to the ports of Los Angeles, Long Beach, and LAX. And so the intent of that engagement was to uh, really help to think about how can we leverage technology to minimize threats at the ports of entry, whether it's
Mhm.
the airport or a container port. How do we leverage those technical platforms to minimize threats and, more importantly, to see them before they happen so leadership can make decisions? Ultimately, everything we do from a risk mitigation, crisis preparedness, or business continuity perspective is all about helping organizations to make informed decisions. And so being able to give them data, being able to give them facts, and then being able to also communicate the story of risk, because risk is nothing but a story, helping them to communicate that story in such a way where they can provide the influence that they need to get the resources. So it was an interesting engagement. I felt like I wasn't smart the whole time because I worked with postdoctoral engineers and they were extremely smart people. Their side of the brain is not my side of the brain. I'm a liberal arts major. But ultimately, it was a really great experience, and having access and the opportunity to see things that I didn't grow up seeing. Prior to 2006, Homeland Security and emergency management was not even a major.
Wow.
So that's what I mean when I say I never thought that would be something that I would focus on, because prior to me even applying to school 2 years before that, that major wasn't even thought of. It wasn't until, so some of the things that set the foundation for that was 9/11 and then Hurricane Katrina. And then ultimately George W. Bush, who was the, president at the time, he thought about, well, hey, we need to have curriculum so that we can help to create more people in this field. And then also organizations and universities like Savannah State, how do we help to create a pipeline of African-American talent in the federal space? Mm-hmm. My career kind of so after I left the Homeland Security space, I kind of figured out government wasn't my thing, and I really liked the private sector better. So I dug my heels into the private sector environment.
Okay. So were you surprised at the number of potential threats that a company can face when you started learning it?
So surprised, yes. I think what was more surprising, as the more exposure that I had in the industry and the more that I was able to come in contact with different organizations, preparedness looks different for everybody. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is no matter what your brand is, there's a level of unpreparedness, if you will, that goes along with every organization. And so now when people say, well, are you surprised such and such didn't have a plan or such and such was on the news? It doesn't surprise me anymore. Gotcha. Because at the end of the day, people run those companies. And I always say people can either create your crisis or they execute your crisis strategy.
Okay.
So.
Gotcha. So now when working with companies, what are the types of products or services that your business offers? Yeah.
So we've nailed this down into really 4 different categories. So one is training. Ultimately, people come to us for knowledge, to help them build capacity, to help them to understand what is business resilience, what is crisis management, what is business continuity. And the feedback we get from our customers is you help to take this very complex process and you help to simplify it into a way that makes sense. So that's our number one goal. Our training program helps people to do 4 things. We help you to crawl, walk, run, or we can help you sprint.
Okay.
With training and knowledge, that doesn't change behavior, right? Mm-hmm. So our second offering that we provide is coaching. And that's where we help you to unleash the ideas that you already have within you. We help to hold you accountable. So when you come out of that training program, you have a framework, you have a process for how to execute those different principles of risk, crisis, and continuity into your business. But what they don't have is the accountability piece. So we help to provide you ongoing coaching and take you from a student, a scholar, and a savant. And so the intent there is to help them truly build the capacity within their organizations and to help them grow. The third piece that we do is advisory. And so those are for our clients that say, just for peace of mind, they invest in our business, they invest in our consultants and in our expertise, so that when something happens, no matter when that is, they have direct access to us in less than 4 hours. And we're on their call. We, support them, whatever that looks like. And then the fourth piece is consulting. So if you have an engagement or you have help that you need whether that is helping to implement your risk management program, whether it is helping you to develop your crisis communications playbook, whether that is helping you to write your pandemic plan, whether it's coming in to do a risk management security assessment of your facilities, right? What are some of the threats and the vulnerabilities that we see? If you want us to come in and to execute against that, that's consulting. And so we've been on a journey and a process of helping people to understand what are the differences between training, coaching, advisory, and consulting. And the last piece is thought leadership. A lot of what I do personally to continue to grow the organization is thought leadership. And we're at a place where organizations hire us for public speaking, to facilitate sessions and workshops. And we also have a podcast as well. So that's been an amazing tool to continue to meet other people and build relationships.
Oh, okay. So what's the name of the podcast?
Business Resilience Decoded.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, definitely go check that out. Um, so when it comes down to, all the services that you provide, I think, it spans different areas. And I so agree with you. I mean, it's one thing to be trained about something and or to be aware of potential issues. It's another thing to actually be prepared. And it's a whole nother thing to actually execute when it happens. So what are some of the misconceptions that you find when it comes down to just awareness about what could happen?
Well, oftentimes, so it depends on the size of the organization. So we have a few different groups of people. Some folks we meet have no idea what their risks are. They have no idea what crisis management is or business continuity. For them, it's all the same thing. Mm-hmm. Then we have some clients or some relationships where they have pockets of what I call resilience. So you may have a communications team, you may have a cybersecurity team, but you probably don't have physical security, you don't have business continuity, you may not have proper risk mitigation protocols. So your board of directors having governance, they don't have those systems in place for the business. And then we have clients that are a well-oiled machine. You have the resources, you have the funding, you have the people who have the skill set. And typically when they engage us, they're looking for us to help them benchmark, to help them do a gap analysis, and to help them see what others of like-sized companies in their industry are doing so they maintain their competitive environment. And so from that perspective, typically we see organizations that have the biggest misconception of they don't know what their risks are. So I always say, if you can't see it, you can't solve for it. So how do I know what my risks are? And that's the first step. You need to be able to identify what they are in alignment to your strategy. So where are you going, right? How are you going to physically get there? And then what are the risks that are in the middle of that can either help you or harm you? So risk is really a threat and it's an opportunity. It doesn't always have to be bad. So for example, growth. Growth is great, but it's also a threat. Because as business owners, what happens when we grow? Growth sucks the cash, which is the oxygen from your business. And if you don't have enough top line revenue coming into the company, then growth can take that away from you, which can then turn into a threat. And so truly being able to think about how you're going to grow. We have companies that say all the time, well, hey, we're going to grow in X, Y, and Z industry over the next 2 years. And we're going to have a new location and A, B, C, and D, right? Mm-hmm. And so my questions are always about, great. So what's the risk to growing this fast, and do we really have the proper infrastructure and the capacity to grow, right? Mm-hmm. So oftentimes, we always say processes run the business, technology supports it. It's really hard to grow without the infrastructure of your processes and procedures. Mm-hmm. And especially for us as business owners, we need to offload things off of our plate but it's hard to engage your team and to empower them to act when we don't have the proper resources for them to be able to do that with. So I would say understanding risk management and what your risks are is the number one misconception that I see people have.
Gotcha. And I laugh when you mentioned about the growth because it reminded me, I was having a conversation with actually one of my clients a couple of days ago, and they were talking about that, they had all these ideas and they see all this opportunity to grow their business and they want to they want to expand. And, they've been taking advantage of the time to think during the pandemic and figure some stuff out. And one of the things I reminded of, I was like, well, you need to nail down some very critical processes in how you do your business or how you run and manage your business. Because like, if you have some weaknesses, growing your business or expanding your business is only going to make those weaknesses bigger. You're just going to have those same weaknesses in more places. So I'm like, you really have to make sure that you have the right processes in place. And I was talking more so from a finance and kind of an accounting perspective. And I hadn't even touched on, hey, all the other areas that you mentioned about like when it comes to growing, like, hey, there's a lot of factors to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So now when it comes down to working with clients, how do they usually get in touch with you to say, hey, we'd like you to come in or we'd like to reach out to you for your services?
Yeah, a number of ways. So one is through our marketing channels. So of course we have a podcast. I do a lot of public speaking. So some of our clients hire us to either MC national conferences or they hire us or myself to be a keynote speaker. So that is one of many ways. We've also do a lot of presentations and really have, intimate discussions with business owners and decision makers. And what we've seen is when we kind of tick that nerve and that thought bubble goes up, that's when folks say, hey, we haven't thought about this for the organization. Can we please have a conversation? Another way is, through this COVID-19 process that's happened, we've seen that the government has started to now place some importance on business owners and supply chain resiliency. And so they're now looking at, well, how do we make sure business owners have a clear understanding of what their risks are, how to measure them, and how to mitigate those impacts? How do we make sure that before the next pandemic or whatever the next thing is, they can navigate a crisis? How do we make sure that they can have a business continuity strategy, right? On how do I continue business if I lose 50% of my workforce, or if my technology fails, or if I can't access my building and I get no notice, right? And so through those processes and through those changes in policy, we're now seeing people are hiring us to come in and provide supply chain resiliency to help create some consistency and to further develop the capacity of their suppliers to be more effective in those areas. So marketing is huge for us.
Yeah, and I think that that's a very big area because that one hits home for me. I spent more of my career kind of working between GE and Navistar from a more of a kind of, they were industrial manufacturing companies. So from the supply chain side, that was where I really started to see, if you have one, I guess you say, break in your supply chain, your entire system will start to feel the effects. Because I remember where there was one I was a finance leader for, and I think you and I, when we had spoken on the phone, I told you about this one, was I was a finance leader. We were in the middle of trying to close a $20 million contract, and one of our major supplier had a devastating fire, which meant it's like, okay, all right, how are we going to still convince this customer to sign this $20 million contract? And by the way, my supplier won't be back up and running for another 18 months. So it was one of those things where I was just like, wow, we probably should have been a little bit more prepared for some. Maybe we should have had multiple suppliers, that we could have been able to use dual suppliers. And it really started to teach me about, finding those single point of failures in the supply chain.
Yep.
So without giving us too much of what you would do if a client came and hired you, what are maybe one or two of the things that common risks that you see that companies just aren't prepared for?
That's a big one. So here is how I'll answer that. The framework that we utilize is about people, processes, infrastructure, and technology. So from a people perspective, again, people can either create your crisis or they execute your crisis strategy. What we often don't help, or what we often don't think about, is people need to know explicitly, they need to be provided explicit, clear guidance. Who, what, when, where, why, and how do you want me to do it? And sometimes we don't give them what they need to be able to execute against that. From a people perspective, sometimes we also underestimate an internal threat within the organization, especially when it comes to fraud. Those typically comes from people within the company who've been there for an extended period of time or who have a significant amount of power. And so being mindful of who those people are and where the opportunities may be. From a process perspective, that to me is about operations, right? So the inputs and the outputs of the business, which includes the supply chain. And so thinking about, what are those gaps in our processes that we may not have figured out? What are some of those holes? And have we created a vulnerability, and does somebody have the potential to penetrate those holes that we're not thinking about, that we're not seeing? How can that impact operations, whether it's from a quality perspective, whether it is we're spending too much time and we're wasting, whether it's time, money, resources, or a product. From an infrastructure perspective, I think people sometimes don't realize all the things that we depend on, right? So roads, bridges, water, power, your facilities, so people don't necessarily think about who they depend on to get stuff done and who their business depends on in order for them to continue to operate. So for example, if you're a landlord, or if you have a landlord, right, what is that relationship like with your landlord who's providing you that lease, and helping them to manage the risk just within that relationship? And then the fourth piece is technology. So processes run the business, and technology is designed to support that and to help facilitate a rapid response for how you deploy, for how you execute. So there's the risk of technology and the systems that we depend on. If they fail, if there's a loss of power, if there's a water leak in the data center, and then you no longer have access to your data, how long can you continue to operate the business? But then also from a cybersecurity perspective, right? And some of those vulnerabilities we're seeing, especially in the healthcare space, they've seen an uptick for the past couple of years of more cyber vulnerabilities that have come through the supply chain, simply because the businesses that they hire, their vendors and their suppliers, don't have the proper risk mitigation protocols as it relates to cybersecurity. And so those companies are causing vulnerabilities into their clients' companies, which is costing them more money, impacting their reputation, and having an impact from a regulatory perspective, as well as on the bottom line.
Okay.
So those are the kind of the four ways of how we look at risk. Of course, you can have a different perspective on all of that, but to simplify it, people, process, infrastructure, and technology.
Okay. No, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And I think there's something that even myself, you just don't think about the technology of your suppliers. And I think as we start to see more systems being integrated, like in supply chain, one of the big things we're trying to integrate a automatic trigger to, trigger demand when the supplier stock goes down. But when you're doing that technology integration, if their system doesn't have the right level of security, it does create vulnerability in your system. Yep,
absolutely.
Now, when we talk about currently the situation that we're in now, at the time of doing this interview, we are still in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. and the responses. From the companies that you have worked with, have you seen any company or many companies that seem somewhat prepared for a crisis at this magnitude?
Definitely, yeah. So, it goes back to those three sets of companies. Some companies were completely unprepared and had nothing in place. Some companies had pockets of preparedness. And then some companies were a well-oiled machine who had the pandemic plan, who had the crisis management plan, who had the business continuity program. And what I always say is, words are words on paper, which is the plan. But words don't move. People do. And the only way people can move and to be ready to execute in times of crisis is if they train. And so that's the importance of people being able to train pre-crisis. So coming from aviation, I always use pilots. Pilots train over 1,500 hours a year, right? So when birds fly in the engine of an aircraft, your pilot isn't scared. They're not Googling what to do, right? They pick up the playbook, they flip to page 5, they execute the plan, and they land the airplane. And their job, their goal is to save, we call them souls, save the souls on board. That's their goal. They don't panic when that happens. And so thinking about the response to COVID-19, we've seen things across the spectrum. We've seen business owners, leaders of companies, of divisions. Some have panicked. Some had no clue what to do. And rightfully so. I mean, this is not something that you see every day, right? So that's been something for us to pay attention to. Some have, they started out, panicking, and then over time, eventually got to a place where they felt more secure and they were able to execute better and really show up and put themselves back in control of the crisis, which is what our, goal is. Like we told our clients, a number of them, my goal is to take you off the football field and bring you to the press box so you can see the bigger picture. Because the pandemic is one thing. And a lot of people, even now, we're 6 weeks into this, we're still, sheltering in place if you're in Charlotte, but we're seeing a number of people that are still very, very focused on the crisis. And what we're trying to get people to think about is what's next. What are the next 2 years like, right? So from my perspective, your big, hairy, audacious goal for your business, your 10 to 20 year plan or strategy, your strategy or your goal, your goal doesn't change. So if you still want to be the number one provider or X, Y, and Z for your business, to me, that doesn't change. But your strategy and how you get there is definitely changing in this environment. And so we believe crisis management is 80% communications, 20% strategy. And so having that strategy is absolutely critical, but you also have to communicate all throughout that process. And everything about crisis management is communications. I mean, for the last 6 weeks, we've been communicating, right? At the end of the day, everybody is communicating. Now, whether your message is good or not, that's a different conversation.
And then that brings up a really good point, because I've noticed the difference from different companies that I've worked with where they've had a consistent line of communication, like if something happens or they're just changing a process or a procedure changes, of being able to communicate that throughout the organization. Now, of course, the bigger you get, the more challenging that gets. But what have been some of the things that you've seen companies do well and being able to improve that communication or have the infrastructure to communicate effectively?
I would say if we're talking about COVID, one of the most important things to me has been about people. I've seen some companies do this extremely well, where they are leading with empathy, they're leading with trust, they're leading with hope, they're leading with influence. And for us, influence is about your character, your competence, and your ability to connect with people. and they're making decisions that are not based on the bottom line, but they're based on their people.
Mm-hmm.
And no matter what, the decision is about making sure people feel safe and that they feel like they can trust you as a leader and that you're putting them in good situations. So for example, if you're working with an organization who says, hey, when this quarantine lifts, you're going to have to come back into work. And if you don't want to come back into work, that's fine, but you're not going to have a job. To me, that's not leading with empathy.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
But we've seen two ends of that spectrum. And some companies have an advantage to be able to do that, whether it's because of their resources or their culture, and some companies don't. But regardless, I'm a firm believer, if you take care of your people, everything else will flow. And so I would say the people component is one of the things that we've seen companies do extremely well, and just thinking about the communications, right? So before you send something out, before you communicate to them on social media or whatever your vehicle is, really thinking about, what do I want people to know before I send this? Or once they read this, what do I want them to know?
Okay.
How do I want people to feel? And then what do I want them to do? Because oftentimes we think about what I want you to know. Maybe we think about how I want you to feel. But very rarely do we think about, what do I want them to do when they finish reading this or hearing this? And we've just seen going through that process and helping people to think about that has helped them to tweak the message. For some of our clients in the communications world, we're helping you to craft a message that you can sell.
Mm-hmm.
And not sell to your customers, a message you can sell to your people, to your suppliers, to your employees. And so really thinking about the no, feel, do, which is a change management approach, but it completely works in this environment because, again, people are impacted. Your company didn't ask to be in a pandemic, and neither did your people.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've had, folks say, well, hey, how are you measuring productivity while they're at home? And I respect all that.
Mm-hmm.
I understand it. But what I also challenge them with is, how about the single mother who has 3 kids, having to be the math teacher, the science teacher, and the English teacher, cook food, and their employer is requiring them to be on video the whole day. And she's not on video because she doesn't want to be a team player, but it's because I have a house full of kids. I'm going halfway insane, and video is adding on the extra stress, and it's also keeping me from being able to be mom while I'm at home.
Mm-hmm.
And so my challenge back to leaders has been, how are you measuring empathy?
That's a good one. I think that's a good perspective to have, because I had that conversation on another episode of our podcast where I was talking with someone that was on as a co-host, Chris Word, and one of the things that we had talked about is being in the position of having been managers of other people. One of the things that we lean to is being very clear about what the deliverables are, and then understanding that now their way of getting work done, like the time that they're going to get it done or the time of day or how long it takes them, is going to vary. Instead of focusing on, hey, I want to make sure you're constantly working, it's just, hey, these are the deliverables. How do we adjust based on your dynamics to when can I expect these to be done? And it's like being honest, because like I said, I don't have children, but I have talked to many of my friends who do have children, and they said, you know what, I appreciate my kids' teachers more than ever before, because I did not know it was like this, trying to work and be a teacher, trying to manage all this. And I think also people have their own anxieties about, what's going on as well, to where it is drastically changing, what people can, I guess you say, the timing that people can deliver. And then I think that, I agree with you. Leaders do have to be way more flexible than before, and just really focus on, not necessarily are you working all the time, but really adjusting to say, hey, how do we make the most of the situation we're in right now?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So it has definitely been a pleasure having you on. I know you are definitely a very busy lady during this time, because I know your phone is probably ringing off the hook. So I want to thank you so much for coming on to the interview. And before we go, how can people find you, your contact information, so they can follow all of your, like your speaking schedule or the different events, or hire you for your services?
Yeah. So one is through social media. So you can follow the company at Asfalis Advisors. So ASFALISADVISORS, all on social media. You can follow me at Vanessa V Mathews with 1 T, all on social media. If you want to contact us, you can go to our company's website. There's a contact form, as well as we have an events page. And so you can always keep up with what we're doing. So we can serve you on any channel that you choose to connect.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.